I wanted to do this whole silly intro for the Campark X15 where I had dramatic music and I just stared down the camera and said, "Son, you have disappointed me." But now here we are doing it in an even more silly kind of roundabout way. But that's sort of what it comes down to with this camera. So what do we have for the Campark X15? We have fake 4K at 30 frames per second, real 1080p 60, 1080p 40-ish with image stabilization, and still images that are nowhere near the claimed resolution. And all of this is such a big disappointment because it's 2020 and camera sellers really should be getting their stuff together when it comes to advertising the correct formats that these cameras can film at, not lying about their resolution. And well, I think also the problem is on Amazon for allowing this to happen, but that's in another video. So let's talk about the X15 today, and I'll show you where it's good, where it's bad, and then in the end recommend that you buy something else. From a build quality perspective, the X15 is one step up from as cheap as they come. It's got a hollow plastic feeling to it and a battery door that will just fall away and disappear. When it comes to user interface, however, completely the opposite. This user interface is pretty much the gold standard in terms of action cam UIs, copied from Novatech and Ambarella and all the other high-end action cams. It can be navigated both with the touchscreen or buttons, and then the settings menu are broken down into the mode you're in and overall camera settings, making things easier to find. So if we're keeping tally, that's one good thing about the camera, the menus, and one bad thing about the camera, the build quality. To be fair, that build quality is fairly standard for cameras under $60, but unfortunately the video quality is not able to redeem this camera. First, a little bit about the technical side of this camera. Here is your 4K 25. It's going to be motion JPEG with linear PCM audio. It looks fine if you hold the camera steady, but the second you start moving it, it gets all like this horrible wobble to it. It's just not very good overall. And the hard facts are that this image sensor is not 4K. It's got the OV4689, which is 4 megapixels, and 4K requires an 8 megapixel sensor minimum. It's based on a processor called the iCatch V35, which is actually a rebranded Sunplus SPCA6350. What that means in layman's terms is a maximum of 1080p 60 frames per second, with this newer V35 version also being able to do EIS. The image sensor itself is the OmniVision OV4689, which is a 1440p image sensor, not 4K. So how does this camera produce fake 4K then? Well, it uses something called motion JPEG, which is basically taking a sequence of still images and mashing them together into a video file. And yes, I understand how confusing that is. It sounds like an ordinary video, and in a way it is, but it's not the same as most action cams which shoot in an MPEG-4 format. Even the 1080p 60 and 1080p 30 are MPEG-4. In a motion JPEG file, each individual video frame is rendered and compressed as a JPEG image. And the compression has no regard for what's going on in the video, any motion or movement, and that can cause problems. Most typically it's seen in terms of blocky shapes in the sky, motion that is just jagged and wobbly, and frame loss overall. And to be fair to the Campark X15, as well as other cameras based on this same hardware, they do a good job of faking it when there's not a lot of action in the frame. On top of that, the X15 sensor is only capable of 2K video, so the highest real resolution that this camera could put out, even if the other hardware was capable of it, would be 2K. I tried to make that as easy to understand, but I know it's a little bit technical. What you really need to know is that this camera is fake 4K, and it's not competitive with cameras that are $20 or $30 more, such as the Campark V30. We'll get to that in a little bit. Let's look at next something that the camera can do, 1080p 60 without image stabilization. 1080p 60 from this camera, it's actually very good overall. There is a ton of distortion on this camera and no distortion control, which gives everything this real significant fisheye effect, and some users may find it unpleasant. That being said, there's lots of detail, the colors are vibrant but not too vibrant, and the audio quality is quite acceptable. With that stabilizer turned off, this camera produces a 1080p 60 video that I'd say is pretty much what you'd want from 1080p 60. There's almost nothing to complain about. So let's turn the image stabilization on, and then I have something to complain about. Look at the difference. I uploaded this video in 60 FPS, so you could really see the difference between the 1080p 60 without EIS and the 1080p 60 with it turned on. What's happening here has to do with the camera's processor. It's not powerful enough to render 60 frames per second and make image stabilization calculations at the same time, so every third or fourth frame gets doubled up. It's still got pretty good detail and pretty good color and pretty good audio, but it just doesn't look smooth. Drecky, you may say, how about the 1080p 30? If it can't render 60 frames per second, surely it could do 30, right? Well, yeah, that's right. It can do 1080p 30 with EIS, and there's no frame drops and everything looks smooth and proper. However, the EIS itself is just not very good. In general, the EIS causes some, well, I'd call it wobbling at the top and bottom of the frame that is just aesthetically unappealing. And you kind of have to have the EIS turned on in some situations. For example, check out this handlebar shot with it turned off. In this situation, which is something that I test every single camera I have in, this Campark X15 is more shaky than other cheap action cams I've used, and the only reason I can think of is because the mounting hardware is lower quality. And it just perturbs me overall that not only is the EIS lower quality than other cameras, it has to work harder thanks to those cheap mounts. So check out this 1080p 60 footage with the DB Power D5 versus the Campark X15. Two cameras that were at their launch a similar price, but unfortunately the D5 is not available anymore. The X15 actually has more detail, but the D5 has that buttery smooth 60 frames per second and better image stabilization, plus real 4K 30, plus real 14 megapixel still images, and yeah, the list goes on. Needless to say, I'm disappointed that the D5 isn't available anymore. Back to the X15, we've got other resolutions, 720p 120, which is alright. No EIS on that one. Wonder why? 16 megapixel still images, which are just upsized from 4 megapixels, and yeah, that's not exactly genuine. And yeah, that brings me to the crux of this camera. Like most Campark cameras I've seen, this is essentially generic internal hardware that Campark may have customized a little bit, but is more or less what you'd expect out of the box. The X15 is very similar to Akaso's EK7000 Pro, and I'm pretty sure there's another half dozen cameras on Amazon at this price point that are pretty much identical. And the results that I've seen testing a half dozen cameras based on this hardware, they're all pretty much the same. Maybe one does still photos a little bit better, maybe one does, I don't know, color a little bit better, but in reality, they're just generics. To be fair to the X15, it's pretty consistent in what it can do. If you're looking for 1080p 30 or 1080p 60 without image stabilizer, it's decent enough. But if you spend $20 to $30 more, there's the Campark V30, which is just better in every way. It's got true 4K 30 frames per second with excellent EIS, still photos that are actually 14 megapixels, 1080p 90 frames per second if you need high speed. And yeah, maybe that camera's not perfect too, but it's a hell of a lot better than this one. So here are a couple more samples for the outro, and yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. I'm always curious to hear what you have to say. Don't forget to like the video, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. So I'm back in my car and out of the wind, and I just wanted to say a few things to wrap this up. The Campark X15 frustrates me. There's a couple really good things about it. The user interface is quite good, the audio quality is really good, and all of the lights on it actually flash. That's so rare. Every other camera I've tested recently, maybe the front light doesn't flash, or the back light doesn't flash, or only 2 of the 4 lights flash when they're recording, and it's very hard to see when the camera's actually recording. But that brings us to the video quality. So it's not real 4K, it's not real 2.7K, it's got really good 1080p, but with the EIS turned off. 1080p 60 is sharp, with the EIS turned off. 1080p 30 is sharp, but once you get that EIS on, it causes some serious problems. Like in the 60 FPS mode, it starts to drop frames just because the processor cannot handle doing the 1080p 60 and the EIS. So apparently it can do 2.7K 30 EIS. I don't believe this. I don't believe that it's doing EIS at all, from what I can see on screen. Woo. And we're back to 1080p 60 with the EIS turned off. If you can hold the camera steady, this is far and above the best format that it shoots at. I honestly can't believe Akaso got famous with the EK7000, which was basically just a rebrand of the H9R, or this thing. I mean, I guess overall it's fairly consistent audio quality and decent 1080p 60,